Good morning and welcome to this AHDB webinar, which today will focus on the EU exit and the red meat trade and the reality 3 months on. This is a follow-up session to one we ran just before the Christmas period, and it really reflects on what's happened in the meantime. And we've assembled the previous speakers and some new additions to reflect on the changes that have occurred excuse me, in the 3 months. So I'm Phil Hadley, I'm International Director for AHDB, responsible for our overseas activity. And we have a number of speakers today. Well, as speakers and a panel, I'll just introduce them very briefly. Tanya Gesto-Casas, who is our EU Policy Manager based in the AHDB office in Brussels. Rizvan Khalid, who's Managing Director of Euro Quality Lambs and Exports to Continental Europe. Knud Bull, who's a representative from the Danish Food and Agri Council, obviously European trade, both in and out for pig meat sector in particular. Cormac Healy, representing the red meat sector in the Republic of Ireland, and Ian Stevenson, representing Northern Ireland. So a great collection of speakers. We have the opportunity for a panel and some reflection on thoughts. And I'd encourage you to feed in your questions via the chat bar to make sure that you can ask your questions of the speakers, and we'll try our very best to get those into the conversation. So exports are a key area for AHDB, both in terms of the market access activity and the in-country trade development work that we do. We've had some good success of late in the last few years on market access approval for new countries, emerging markets for us, working in partnership with government and industry, and successfully achieved new access to markets like the US, China and Japan. And of course, we remain very active on the market development front, the in-country work across our key strategic markets, including Asia, North America more latterly, and in particular Europe. Of course, Europe remains critical to the sectors in terms of ongoing trade. So the Brexit discussions were obviously right at the top of the agenda. We have an office in France led by Remy Fourier and an extensive team of agents representing those key European markets. Just before I hand over to Tanya, just the housekeeping elements. As delegates, you're very welcome to this webinar, and we appreciate your time to listen in. Hope you find it useful. And again, please pop your questions in the chat bar. You will stay muted throughout the webinar, and we're due to finish around 11:30 AM. We'll have a presentation and then a panel and the opportunity for questions. There'll be some polls throughout the session for you to give your views. They'll take 30 seconds or more just to click on to get some thoughts from the audience. The webinar will be recorded, or is being recorded, and will be published on YouTube after. So if you want to share that link with colleagues, please feel free to do so. And then just as we close, there'll be a survey at the end to ask you for your thoughts and reflections on that webinar, and we'd be really grateful if you'd just take a second before you depart to fill in that survey. So without further delay, I shall hand over to our first speaker, although actually I think David, one more slide. Sorry, I've got a little bit ahead of myself. I just wanted to take a second whilst I have the opportunity to introduce the UK government's Open Doors campaign, which is promoting exports, particularly in the red meat and dairy sectors, to SME businesses to encourage support and growth. We as AHDB are a supporting partner, as indeed is the NFU and others. Red meat and dairy focused, the dairy webinar launched the programme last week, and we have a red meat one scheduled for the 23rd of April. So please make a note in your diary because that's relevant to this audience, and click on or identify that link below and you'll be able to get some more details and potentially participate in a launch of a mentor program. So I've just taken a second, I've stolen a moment from Tanya to raise that. It is relevant to red meat exporters, particularly in the SME sector. So Tanya, apologies. Tanya is our policy manager in the AHDB office in Brussels, and she's going to set the scene in terms of the political dynamics, where we've come from, where we are now, and that'll lead into the panel discussion in a moment. So over to you, Tanya. Thank you very much.
No problem. Hello, everyone. So as Phil said, I'm Tania Gesto-Casas, and I'm the policy manager in the AHDB Brussels office. And today, just going to review some of the main changes in the EU-UK trade relationship since the last time we met for our first AHDB EU exit and red meat trade webinar in November 2020. So I know some of you will be very familiar with what I'm going to present now. But the objective of this presentation is just to make sure that everyone in the audience is in the same page ahead of the panel discussion that we will have later today. So next slide, please, David. So as I was saying, we hosted our first EU exit and red meat trade webinar in November, and what has changed since then? Well, one of the main changes is that the EU and the UK have finally managed to reach an agreement on their future relationship. So in very late in December, we had the good news that the agreement had been reached, and then it was signed on the 30th of December, and it's provisionally applying since the 1st of January 2021. And I say provisionally applying because the EU has not ratified it yet, as they needed more time for the European Parliament to scrutinize the deal. So now, at the moment, the European Parliament hasn't given its consent yet, but there's a deadline for the ratification, and that deadline is the 30th of April. So hopefully that will happen in the coming weeks. Then the end of the year also meant the end of the transition period, and this is what Mr. Barnier used to call the economic Brexit, because the political and institutional Brexit happened in January 2020, when the UK officially became a third country. But now, at the end of this year, the UK also, last year, 2020, the UK also got out of the customs union and the single market, and that has created a very different economic reality. And while we were all very optimistic at the beginning of the year, given the massive achievement of having agreed a trade deal in just 11 months, the reality is that during the last few months, there have been a series of tensions between the EU and the UK, and the relationships have deteriorated a little due to different issues, including the vaccines debate and the challenges in Northern Ireland. And obviously, you know, these tensions on relationships always have an effect on trade. So next slide, please. But we are going to focus on the bill itself. So the over 1,200-page long trade and cooperation agreement reached by the parties governs the future trading and security relationship between the EU and the UK, now that the UK is no longer a member of the EU. So you have in this slide a very comprehensive graphic representation of what the deal covers. I'm not going to go into the details of all of this, but just to explain that the deal has like three main pillars. So the first pillar is the free trade agreement itself, covering trade in goods, services, and a broad range of other areas such as investment, transport, and sustainability. Then there's another pillar, which is the new framework for law enforcement and judicial cooperation. And then a third one, which is the horizontal agreement that you can see there in the slide on governance, that provides clarity on how the agreements will be operated and controlled. Now, in addition, the deal is also supplemented by a series of unilateral measures in areas that were not covered by the negotiations. And these are areas such as UK third country SPS listings, which is quite important because this is a requirement for non-EU countries that need to be granted third country listing in order to be able to export certain agricultural products into the EU. Now, the UK government secured third country listing for a number of UK products, but there are some notable exceptions, and that's the case, for instance, of fresh chilled meats, meat preparations that we can no longer export to the EU. So next slide, please. We will be now focusing on the free trade part of the deal. And just first of all, just to clarify that the political ambition for this future trade relationship was set out actually in the political declaration agreed by the parties in October 2019. And in line with that, one of the main achievements of this trade deal is that it provides for zero tariffs, zero quota between the parties. And this has been obviously fantastic news for agricultural trade, because tariffs in some agricultural sectors would have been quite high, and they would have led probably to threats to the viability of some producers, and probably also to higher food prices in the UK. So good news that we have the deal, but we also need to bear in mind that any tariff-free arrangement is always subject to products complying with a new set of rules, which have been in some cases quite challenging. And here I'm referring to rules of origin, which are basically the criteria to establish where a product comes from. Now, another big achievement of the deal is that it provides for, it preserves the regulatory autonomy of the parties, and this was a very important, especially for the UK side, because it means that both parties remain free to set their own rules and legislations. And then last but not least, the deal also includes some level playing field clauses, including commitments to maintain high levels of protection in areas such as labor rights or environmental protection. This is important because it also includes the possibility for the parties to take countermeasures in case they feel that the other party has implemented a change that creates a competitive advantage. And countermeasures, when I say countermeasures, that can mean reimposing tariffs, for instance. So very important. So next slide, please, David. So up to now, we've been talking about what the deal is and what it means, but it is also important to understand what the deal is not. And it is not business as usual. The UK, being out of the single market and the customs union, is now a third country, and there is no free trade deal that can replicate the level of integration that we had as part of the single market and the customs union. This means that there is no way to avoid a certain level of friction, and we are seeing this in the form of checks and controls that are being implemented since day one in trade going from Great Britain to the EU. The deal does include an SPS chapter, but it is relatively thin because there's not really obligation to reduce level of border checks as regards SPS requirements. So really doesn't really make such a big difference in terms of sanitary controls. And then, as I was saying in the previous slide, we also need to take into account that in order to benefit from the arrangements in the deal, we need to comply with new rules, which obviously also have an impact again too. And then finally, there are also some issues that are just simply fall out of the remit of the trade deal, of these negotiations, and therefore require unilateral measures. And those are issues such as the third country listings that I mentioned earlier. So next slide, please. So what has this all meant in practical terms? Well, we'll cover this in more detail during our panel discussion. But here, this slide is just to give you a flavor of the main disruption that meat traders have been experiencing during these first months. And obviously, some of the disruption has been the need to adapt and to understand and implement the rules of origin that I've already mentioned a few times. Also, there has been some disruption due to the need for hard stop of exports of some fresh meat preparations due to those being included on the list of restrictions and prohibitions. There has been also additional requirements for paperwork and preparation related to new requirements to export to the EU, including certification, and this obviously has led to increased costs, both in terms of money and in terms of time, which is quite important as well when you have a just-in-time supply chain. And I'm just lost the slide. I don't know if it's just me or I can no longer see the slides, but yeah, oh, here they are again. And then another point is another disruption we've seen in in relation with haulage challenges and transport difficulties due to some transport models being particularly affected, such as groupage, for instance. And finally, there has been also a set of other disruptions in the borders, including delays, inconsistent application of the rules, and disruption in live animal trade due to lack of suitable border control posts. So next slide, please. And finally, and this is already my last slide, what are the next steps? Well, one crucial next step, particularly for EU operators and UK importers, will be the implementation of the next phases of the border operating model from the UK, because as I was saying earlier, products going from Great Britain to the EU are at the moment experiencing full checks and controls since day one, but that was not exactly the case for products going the other way around from Europe to Great Britain, because the government decided to apply a phased approach to new requirements. These next phases will be implemented in October and at the end of the year, respectively, and those will mean additional requirements for products going into Great Britain as well. Another important next step will be for both parties to just work on come to an agreement on long-term solutions for the issues around the Northern Ireland Protocol, and this is very important because we've had recently an announcement by the UK government on the extension of some grace periods that are applying on Northern Ireland, and that has been obviously useful for the industry, but at the same time it has created tensions with the EU, and tensions in the relationship are never useful for trade. And then ratification is also a pending task for the EU, and this is important because it's necessary to kick off the work of the new institutional framework foreseen in the agreement to manage the relationship and resolve any disputes. So I refer here to the Partnership Council and other specialized committees and trade specialized committees that are foreseen in the TC, in the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, and this will play an important role in the future. So the sooner they can be set up, the better. And I'll stop here. So we can move on to our panel discussion and look into some of these issues in more detail. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tanya. That's a good overview of where we are currently. You touched on a couple of things there of relevance, which was around the tensions and the ratification aspects of the deal. I wonder if you could just comment if you feel that those current tensions may have implications on ratification?
Well, it is true that it was due to some of these tensions, and in particular due to this UK decision to extend some grace periods in Northern Ireland, that the European Parliament kind of postponed a bit their decision for the ratification. But I wouldn't expect, from a personal point of view, I wouldn't expect this having leading to a situation where the trade deal is not ratified. Basically, because as I was saying earlier, this was a very important achievement, getting a trade deal in time, avoiding a no-deal scenario, and we've always said that this is on everyone's interest. So I wouldn't expect this having like major consequences of not getting a trade deal ratified, but it has obviously led to some postponements. That's true.
Okay, thanks for that view, and thank you for your presentation, Tanya. That was excellent. So I'll just introduce the members of the panel now, and they've got their cameras on, which is great. So in the order they appear, first Nud Bull, who's director of the Danish Meat and Bacon Council, Cormac Healy, director of Meat Industry Ireland. There we go. We've all adopted the customary webinar wave. Ian Stevenson, who's chief exec of Livestock and Meat Commission for Northern Ireland, and Rizvan Khalid, who's managing director of Euroquality Lambs in Shropshire and an export, as I said, to Europe in the beginning. So before we get into the panel, I mentioned at the beginning we're going to do some polls. So the first poll I'm going to ask you to participate in, David, if you can start to prepare that, is to ask you of your own assessment of the deal as it stands right now, and whether you consider it to be positive, neutral, or negative. So we'll just take a second to load that poll, and then if you can participate, click on the appropriate button in your view, that would be helpful. We'll just take a few seconds to go through that process. Okay, that should be long enough to have done that, hopefully. And we click back to our speakers. So that's great. Right, do we have? We have 19% there, so in positive, neutral at 39%, and a leaning there towards negative. So interesting results there. Maybe we can tease out some of those points in the panel that follows. And again, I'll remind you to pop in any questions that you have, so we can try and address those before the end of the session. So I'm going to ask the same question to all of the speakers in the order they appear on the screen. As I said right at the beginning, this is a revisit of a webinar we ran before the Christmas break, when we didn't know what it looked like. Clearly now, 3 months on, we do. In that first webinar, Nud also joined that one and asked what 3 issues were on his mind, and he said that it was tariffs, tariffs, and tariffs. So perhaps I'll come to you first, Nud. Now that we know that we're not in that position, what's your assessment of the deal as it stands for your, for your stakeholders' interests?
Good morning, Phil. Good morning, everyone. Now to your question, how good is the deal? It is a bit as when Winston Churchill talked about democracy. It's not an ideal system, but it's the best available alternative. So it's the same way with the deal we got. It is the best among alternatives because, as you said, we avoided tariffs and quotas. Of course, there are still things to solve. and Tanya have touched upon it. There are some obvious mistakes I think we have to address, like the one with the minced meat with triangular trade and the meat preparations. Then there is a big problem with the costs, because of course when you hire in the UK more than 10,000 additional customs officers, that costs a lot of money, and it means that in the end of the day that's an additional burden to the trade. But I would say it's a much bigger burden to small and medium-sized enterprises and operators than to big business. If we compare a little bit the tariff we avoided, if I want to export hands to UK or hands from the UK, if we had had MFN tariffs, it would have been 800 euro per ton approximately. Now, if I'm a big operator exporting from the UK a container load, then the health certificate will cost me like 8 euro per ton. That's 1% of what the duty would have been. If I'm, however, a small and medium-sized operator who only sent 200 kilo, then I'm back to the 800 euro per ton. So I'm like burdened with 40 to 50% of the value. So for small and medium-sized operators, this thing is very bad. So the solution for this problem is, of course, that you get into more smart systems and getting the costs down. Of course, everything would also have been easier if we had, like with Norway and Switzerland, dynamic alignment of our standards, but that's politically impossible. So we have to work not in traces, but with a different system. Again, we can handle that when we are big operators, but I think for the small and medium size, that's also more difficult to handle. But that's just to say a few words in the beginning. It is not as bad as it could have been, so we are confident.
Okay, thank you. No, that's really an important point about the disproportionate cost impact, and I know Rizvan has some strong views from an operator's perspective of the impact it's had on his business and the associated costs. So we'll come to Rizvan shortly. He can perhaps pick up some of those points from a very real commercial perspective. So thank you for that, Nud. I'll come to you next, Cormac, with the same question. Your reflections on the deal from the Republic's perspective.
Yeah, thanks, Phil, and good morning to everybody. I suppose I don't want to echo everything that Knut has said, because I agree with much of it. I think tariffs was going to be a real concern, and as I outlined at the session that you organised before Christmas, the tariff bill on meat exports from Ireland would have run to over 900 million euros. So it would have been a colossal impediment towards trade. It might have been like the Ever Given across the Suez Canal over the last few days in terms of its impact. So therefore, I mean, the deal compared to a no deal or a WTO scenario is a positive. I'm a little bit, well, I suppose shouldn't be maybe overly surprised by the poll. I think it's an interesting response that you've got there, and tending, as you say, towards the negative, and that probably is a reflection of how people are actually feeling about practical trading conditions and the impacts that have been seen so far. And as Knut has touched on, I mean, we achieved a free trade deal, but we didn't achieve a frictionless trade deal, and that certainly is playing out. And I'm acutely aware too that while things have changed for us as exporters into the UK from that perspective, we haven't yet seen the full extent of the changes that have taken place that have been experienced by UK exporters already. So we've seen the customs dimension to our business that has added more bureaucracy and cost, as Knut has said, but the export certification side is yet to come, obviously, and I know we'll touch on that later in the discussion. So certainly we've secured free trade, but we haven't secured frictionless trade, and what we know is that the new trading scenario, you know, in a scenario where we're not all part of the single market, isn't one that lends itself to the type of business that we've developed in the meat side, which is just in time, you know, fresh, chilled delivery, next day delivery. It just is proving very challenging for that. And I think too, our experience also has been, to echo what Knut has said, that the impact intensifies as you go to small and medium-sized operations where the consignments may be smaller. The impact has been greatest, and we clearly see that coming through on the whole area of groupage and the impact on transport in that regard.
Thank you, Cormac. So again, you know, that disproportionate impact is a relevant conversation, and the certification aspects and dynamics, you know, is going to be important going forward. So thank you for your comments, Cormac. Ian, I'll come to you from a Northern Ireland perspective, your view.
Yes, thanks, Phil, and good morning, everybody. I guess from, I suppose, just picking up on our previous two contributors, I think certainly any deal was always going to be better than no deal with the European Union. I think that was certainly a mantra, you know, that was talked about a lot, you know, in the run-up to agreeing a deal. But from a Northern Irish perspective, you know, our situation is slightly different than that of the rest of the UK due to the protocol on Ireland and Northern Ireland. I know we're going to, I suppose, explore that in a wee bit more detail later on, but I guess, I suppose, what that means on the plus side, I suppose our meat industry here in Northern Ireland, I suppose it gives them unfettered access to both the GB market and the EU single market, you know, which is different certainly than what I'm sure Rizvan will talk about in terms of the wider experience of the UK. So our circumstances are slightly different. So that is a positive, I suppose, from our point of view. On the downside, I guess, as Northern Ireland being part of the UK, we're effectively following the EU rulebook. And that certainly is causing, you know, significant disruption to certain types of animal and plant products, you know, coming into Northern Ireland, even with certain grace periods. And I know that's an issue we're going to talk about later. You know, to just give you one example, in terms of, I suppose, our livestock sector, our breeding sheep farmers, you know, there's been a 99% reduction in the live imports of breeding sheep into Northern Ireland in the first 2 months of the year. So that certainly will have a significant impact on the genetic improvement in our sheep industry, you know, and that's a real concern from that sector, and certainly is one of the key issues that our farm organisations have been raising. But I suppose really just to sum up, I guess you could argue, I suppose, that, you know, whilst a trade and cooperation agreement was good to see that being agreed on Christmas Eve, you know, the fact that, you know, there was no implementation period really for industry or for the authorities to get used to the new order of doing things, that perhaps maybe wasn't the best way to conclude a deal of this magnitude without any form of implementation period. And I guess that's why we've seen grace periods and things like that being extended, you know, because just the challenge of implementing these changes are just so significant. So that's, I suppose, an opening assessment from a Northern Irish perspective.
Okay, Ian, thank you very much. That's good to get your comments. I'm going to come to Rizvan now, and Rizvan, as a commercial operator, I wonder if you could just take a second to introduce your business for the delegates briefly, and then talk about, as an operator with a trade to Europe, what you've experienced in those first 3 months, what lessons you've learned, etc. You know, what has it felt like trying to sell your products commercially?
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Rizvan. I'm MD of Euro Quality Lambs. We're a large lamb exporter based in Shropshire. So 75% of our product goes into Europe. We've always focused on the European market from our inception in 1992. You know, approximately a third of UK sheep goes there. So Europe, as everyone knows, has always been very important for the sheep market. Our assessment of the deal, first of all, Phil, was one really of relief that we avoided the tariffs. But like Ian mentioned, there just wasn't enough time to really assess the other impacts that were going to be felt. And in particular, I mean, we're a single site, so we just have one species going abroad. But where you have smaller loads in groupage, where you have composite products, where meat is an ingredient within the product, it is a nightmare for exporters at the moment. We know in January, meat volumes exporting wise from UK was maybe 60% down. Trying to adjust to the new relationship was quite difficult. So just to give attendees a sort of a context over here, we estimate for our trading relationship with our importers that there's going to be increased costs of circa £560,000 per year, and that's pure costs in terms of veterinary inspections, export customs declarations, administration, import customs declaration, import veterinary checks, Eurotunnel charges, border charges. So that's actually a physical cost that's going to be added onto their trading relationship. On top of that, we've already, our products are getting there a day later because the time taken to prepare the documentation and the time taken to go through the border means that we're losing a day's shelf life in getting over there, which makes our product that bit less competitive. And also we've actually lost trade in the form of smaller customers, just as Nude and the rest of the delegates, the panelists have stated. Whether you're selling one pallet or one load, the paperwork is the same and the costs are the same. And so those smaller customers that were ordering a pallet or 2 pallets of product, are not buying, they're buying directly from bigger importers. So we've seen trade starting to reconfigure between larger exporters to larger importers. And so the whole adaptation has been very, very challenging.
Okay, Rizvan, thank you. That's a stark picture of the genuine impact on the commercial trade. Perhaps we can pick up some of those points in the further discussion that follows. I guess just before we move into the next session, just as a bit of a quick reflection, and I'll go back to the same order, is just to ask you all in turn very briefly whether there was a missed opportunity, or if there was one thing you would have liked to have seen, what would that one thing be? So Nud, to you first. One thing, one missed opportunity?
Yeah, one missed opportunity is that it was, I think, obviously a mistake that we have the problem with the minced and the chilled meat preparations, and also the fact that we cannot re-export to Europe, for example, trimmings from meat coming from Europe after processing in the UK. I think people had simply not thought about that was a consequence of becoming a third country on our doorstep. And I hope that could have been rectified, because it gives a lot of problems also vis-a-vis distribution to north of Ireland.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. I realise this question is getting more difficult, so I hope this is giving you, Rizvan, plenty of time to think and reflect in advance. So, Cormac, same question.
Yeah, I agree, and I know you're looking for one, but I mean the anomalies that, and I think that's how best to describe them. Anomalies. These were things that have just thrown up in relation to chilled meat preps, chilled mince, etc. That nobody had a chance to think about or think through, which I suppose leads to the point I'm going to make. One of the biggest issues is that we had no time, as both Ian and Rizvan have said already. I mean, effectively, for businesses, they had 6-7 days between a deal being completed and entry into force on the 1st of January. So, I mean, business never had a true transition period in all of this changeover on any side, be it UK or EU side. Our businesses never had a transition period on this. We were still all waiting on what is going to be the outcome. Is there going to be a deal? Isn't there? And while politicians may point to various time periods and that there was a formal exit of the UK some months previous. We really never had a proper transition period to assess implications.
Okay, thanks, Cormac. Ian?
Yeah, really just to add, I guess, Brexit, I would say it's not a done process. There's a lot still to happen in terms of negotiation of some of these anomalies as they've maybe been described, and some of the difficulties around this. So I suspect, negotiation of certain elements will go on for some time to come. But I know certainly one of the issues that I see being promoted actively at the moment in certain circles within the UK is around a form of veterinary agreement with the EU, and certainly that may be an area you could say that was possibly a missed opportunity, but it's certainly something I think that could perhaps get a bit of traction, over the coming period of time in terms of trying to, I suppose, reduce the friction and the amount of checks and etc. required at the border. So we'll see how that one progresses. But that was perhaps an area that was perhaps missed as part of the negotiations.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. That's a really valid point in terms of veterinary type agreements. So Rizvan, you've got the difficult job here, but from a commercial operator's point of view, what was it that you would have liked to have seen or would have done differently given the opportunity?
Well, actually, Ian took the words out of my mouth. In that, if we had a common veterinary area similar to what Switzerland have with the EU, that would have negated a lot of the need for the veterinary certification and the checks at the veterinary checks at the border. Okay, the customs checks and all that would still remain, but most of the friction is caused with the veterinary checks. And I think strategically, at the UK level, the veterinary side of things isn't where they might want to diverge on standards as such. So really, I think the opportunity is to try to align the veterinary area as much as possible to try to get that common veterinary area similar to Switzerland. So that would have been the one fundamental thing that we would have liked to see.
Yeah, okay. So there's a chime of agreement there between Ian and yourself in terms of veterinary agreement. So okay, thank you very much all for your contributions and reflections on those points. I'm now going to hand over to Tanya, who's going to take us through the next bit of the session in terms of the questions. So I'll just turn my microphone off and I'll hand to you, Tanya. Thank you.
Thank you, Phil. So I would like now to focus the conversation on these new arrangements that we've touched on briefly during the previous session and their impact on meat trade. But before turning to our speakers, we have another poll for the audience again. So David, if you could launch the poll so we can have it on screen. And I will read, as Phil did, I will read the question for you and the potential answers. And our question is basically 3 months on, how prepared do you feel to trade under the new arrangements? And there are 4 options there. I feel not prepared. I've stopped operations with Europe. Still not fully prepared, but I continue trading with Europe. Then the third option would be somewhat prepared. I've had some teething problems, but those are progressively smoothing out now. And then the fourth option, most positive one, is I'm very prepared. I have adapted well and haven't had any issue. So again, we'll give you like some 30 seconds to reply to this poll. And while you cast your votes, maybe I just can continue the conversation with our speakers. So I'll go to Rizvan again first. And yeah, Phil said it, you're here, the commercial operator, the only commercial operator in the panel. And you already touched in the previous question, you already touched a bit on the main disruptions that you have been facing as a business. So it would be interesting to see what would you think that it will be in this poll? What do you think is going to be the option that most businesses in Great Britain would choose?
I would say somewhere between the second and third one. I would expect a few to say maybe stopping operations with Europe, but most of the teething problems, Tanya, have been resolved. It's now more structural problems. The first few times a company exports, there always is a level of preparation for new processes, but once you get a few done, it's more the structural issues of the time delays. And I know generally for meat traders, groupage is a very big issue, where there was consignments of lots of smaller lots going across, where now, I mean, many hauliers have stopped taking groupage consignments because if one paperwork is wrong, the whole load will get stopped. So it's a big risk for someone to be part of a groupage consignment. And so there are lots of unintended issues or consequences because of the new arrangements. Tanya, you're on mute.
Oh, sorry. That always happens. Sorry. Yeah, I was saying that I think David, you could launch now the results of the poll to have a look at, and definitely you were very right, Rizwan, that most of the people were between the second and the third option, which are like with slightly bit more of people saying that they are somewhat prepared. They had some teething problems, but they are smoothing out, but there are still a good amount of people, 39%, that say that they are still not fully prepared but continue to trade with Europe, and some, yeah, not a 5% that also says that they are not prepared and they have fully stopped operations. So Rizwan, you were really very right. So thank you very much, David. I think you can now take that out of the screen, and let's continue now with our European speakers, so Cormac and Knut. As you've mentioned earlier, obviously the situation for EU operators is slightly different because the UK is applying this phased approach to control. So you haven't been facing the full requirements and checks yet. But still, obviously, it is not business as usual. So what level of disruption have meat traders in your specific countries experienced so far, and how would you expect the situation to evolve in the coming months? Are your companies already getting ready for these next phases of implementation of checks and controls in October and then the end of the year? So I will start, well, this question is for Cormac and Knut. Let's start with Knut first for a Danish perspective from the continent, and then we'll go to Cormac.
Yeah, I can make it very short. At present, we have no problems. We feel that we are prepared. We were prepared for the 1st of April, but now we can get even more prepared for the 1st of October. We, of course, talk a lot with our UK clients. We export to all over the place in the UK. And of course, we hear about that they are worried about how to distribute to North of Ireland in the future. But at present, we see no problems in our export. We have a small import of products from the UK to Denmark. We have not experienced problems there either. I know of one case where there was an error in some documents, but that was swiftly handled by the authorities, so it didn't impact the performance of the import. So from this side, no problems.
Well, that's quite positive to hear, definitely. Cormac, from an Irish perspective, do you agree?
Yeah, well, I think trade is continuing. I wouldn't quite agree. Yes, it's true, as you say, Tanya, that we have had I suppose, the benefit of a phased approach that has been set out by the UK government. That said, it isn't the case that nothing has changed. I mean, we've had significant change already. Firstly, with the whole revenue dimension coming in, and customs procedures being applied to exports from the beginning of the year. And the other aspect, I suppose, that impacted and concerned us quite a bit from an Irish perspective is the land bridge and transiting goods across to customers in the EU, transiting the UK. And that certainly has seen changes too since the 1st of January. Thankfully, on one side, there has been an increase in direct shipping capacity from Ireland to the continent, principally to France. That increased capacity has come on stream and is being used by exporters, not just food exporters, but by many others. But it certainly is being used by our meat exporters. Nevertheless, the capacity that has been brought in there hasn't been sufficient. I don't think ever could be sufficient to replace the volume of our trade that was using the UK land bridge. So it remains extremely important and will into the future. And for that, we have, I mean, the experience from exporters to date, I think, has been mixed. Certainly, transiting the UK and entering the EU via the Netherlands, for example, on those routes has worked more smoothly than the land bridge route to France, and there are still ongoing issues there for exporters and concerns around those. So we continue to work on those. I think, you know, by and large, our main meat exporters, you know, have had over the years a familiarity with the customs requirements because of exports to international markets. So by and large, they were prepared for that change from the 1st of January to deal with the customs procedures, and that went smoothly. But you know, as we've touched on already, for smaller operators and exporters, smaller consignments, there was a newness to it and a bit of catch up to be done in the early days. I think a lot of that has smoothed itself out. One of the noticeable things that was happening in the early days of January was that, you know, product was moving from Ireland across to GB. But because of challenges from the GB perspective, return loads and backloads for those hauliers became an issue, and it had an impact on the cost of transport. I mean, many of the hauliers were coming back empty, but that again seems to have smoothed out. As far as the next step, and we do have the next step to go, I admire Canoode's confidence and positivity that they were ready for the 1st of April, and no doubt they were. I could say we were also hoping we were ready, but I am glad that it has been moved out from the 1st of April. I think, again, I mean, there is a certain regime in place for export certification, and I think we would have been largely ready, but I have no doubt there would have been some significant teething problems. And one of the things to remember is that, I mean, it's not just for meat; it's also certification for dairy, for composite goods, etc. So the volume involved of export certification is massive, and I think that's one of the particular things that Rizvan has been calling out, and I know that has been highlighted in the recent BMPA report, that there are the technical issues. The first consignment that goes always brings, you know, new learnings, and there may be errors and misinterpretations on both sides. You work through those, but then there is, after all of that, there is structural change, and I think in that regard, we will use the time between now and the 1st of October to continue to press to make sure we have everything in place as much as possible. We will be using the traces system for our meat export certification. we need to make sure that the new version of that is available before the 1st of October, rather than what is being talked about now, that it will be available at some stage in the later part of October. Makes no sense that we have a new system coming in maybe 3 weeks after that new extended deadline that the UK government has given. So there are all those kind of issues, and I think that area of using traces and e-certification is an area perhaps that we're not going to have resolved or clarified by the 1st of April, but I think it's an area that everyone needs to be pushing on, that we find ways to use e-certification as much as possible, and electronic transfer of documentation. I'll leave it at that, Tanya.
Yeah, indeed. No, those are good points, and I'm seeing in the comments that there are some asking as well in the comment in our audience, asking that we should consider even a further postponement of those controls to ensure Christmas trade is not disrupted. So there's definitely mixed views in terms of the level of preparedness for these next phases. So we'll stay a little bit longer in Ireland, in the island of Ireland, but we'll go north to Ian. Obviously, Northern Ireland is in a very special situation, as we mentioned, due to the challenges of implementing the Northern Ireland Protocol. But how is it working for the Northern Ireland meat industry?
Okay, thanks, Tanya. Yes, I guess to put, I suppose, in context, the Northern Irish situation, we are a small population of 1.8 million people here in Northern Ireland, but we produce enough food, I suppose, to feed 10 million people. So we have to export about 80% of our beef and lamb, or sorry, about 90% of our total beef and lamb. About 80% of our beef and lamb tends to be consumed in the domestic market in the UK, with about 20% consigned to the European markets and some third country markets. But in terms of preparations and how things are working, I would say, you know, our red meat businesses were well prepared. You know, certainly coming into the start of the new regime, they invested a lot of time and effort and training, and worked very closely with our Department of Agriculture and other authorities to get as well prepared as they could be, and certainly they are adapting fairly well to the new arrangements in terms of exports and the unfettered market access. But like everywhere else, it has added extra costs into supply chains, there's no question about that. One of the key elements of our meat processing businesses really would have been, you know, there would have been a traditional sort of movement of product around group sites, certainly within the UK, you know, where there was capacity for cutting and further packing and processing of product, and certainly significant volumes of red meat traditionally would have moved from GB into Northern Ireland, and certainly there's no grace periods applying to the certification of that product. So that has added an element of complexity, but certainly our businesses are working through that, and certainly, you know, have been doing insofar as much as they can to make sure that those traditional trade flows continue. Perhaps one of the, I suppose, the key areas, and I think I mentioned it earlier, in terms of the movement of certain goods into Northern Ireland and certain products into Northern Ireland, you know, certainly at farm level, I know this is mostly about meat, but it's worth reflecting at the farm level sometime as well, because it all feeds through into the supply chain. Certainly we've seen, you know, quite a number of farmers reluctant to send, you know, pedigree animals to Great Britain to sales, for example, you know, similar to what Cormac was saying, because there's challenges of bringing things back again. You know, if you don't sell something, so if you take a pedigree bull to a sale in Stirling in Scotland, for example, it doesn't sell, you have to leave it there for 6 months before you can bring it home again. You know, so there are certain issues around certification that will create difficulties that will be hard to overcome. But I say, so far so good. Our industry has adapted well and is working through the processes insofar as they can, given the circumstances.
Thank you, Ian. So Cormac, from the other side of the border, taking the opportunity that we have here both sides in this panel, what's your view on how the Northern Ireland Protocol is working in practice?
Sorry, I had muted myself. Well, look, I suppose we haven't to date been overly impacted by it. I mean, that's I suppose should be said. I mean, obviously on the island of Ireland, there is movement of both livestock and product, north south, south north, and that continues to flow unimpeded. So from that perspective, it works. I mean, I am conscious and aware of some of the issues that the Northern Ireland industry has faced, and I know in the early days of January they would have you know, highlighted that, and I think Ian referred to it earlier on. Feathered access was what they expected, and while they may have that for consignments moving across from Northern Ireland, or from Northern Ireland directly into GB, they were finding that product coming that took the Dublin route. And that would be quite a significant part of the trade of meat from Northern Ireland across the GB would come through Dublin to serve southern GB customers. Those consignments were not getting through on Feather, that there were additional layers of bureaucracy coming into it. So I'm aware of that, and we've equally flagged that with our own authorities on it. But I suppose, Tanya, for in terms of the protocol, in terms of the north-south, you know, product is moving as normal.
Yeah, well, that's good to hear. So Ian, coming back to you, obviously we've mentioned already some grace periods that are at the moment being implemented in Northern Ireland to allow easier access from product going from GB to NI. But could you comment on the relevance of these arrangements for the meat industry in Northern Ireland? Because these are obviously meant to be temporary. There has been some extension, but these are meant to be temporary anyways. So yeah, could you comment on that?
Yeah, so I guess looking at grace periods in the round, I would say they're currently more relevant probably for authorised traders in the movement of retail goods into Northern Ireland, and certainly we have seen at retail level, we've seen some products in some retail stores no longer available because of the complexity of moving through certain supply chains. But you know, we haven't seen, you know, there was I suppose an initial sort of concern about empty supermarket shelves early on in the process, but those aren't happening as of now, and we've seen some other local retailers and wholesalers sort of helping to plug some gaps in certain product lines. Those businesses, I suppose, that are availing of the grace periods, they obviously have been advised that the scheme, you know, has been extended, you know, to the 1st of October, at which point, you know, there will be a phased certification process that'll be implemented, you know, unless it's extended further. With regard to the products that Knut talked about earlier in terms of the chilled meats and those restricted and prevented products, you know, I guess there has been a 6-month grace period applying for those, certainly entering, you know, from Great Britain to Northern Ireland, and certainly under some very specific conditions. And you know, I guess it has been made clear that, you know, that 6-month period was to be used by supermarkets to adjust their logistics and supply chains, and that at the end of that period, you know, that those products, you know, will probably not be allowed to enter Northern Ireland unless there is, you know, a change in the I suppose the negotiating position. I guess the situation, I suppose, from a, you know, the protocol is quite a political issue, certainly you would say at the moment within the confines of Northern Ireland. I don't want to get into the politics of it, but certainly at last Friday's meeting, you know, I think there is an expectation certainly within the UK that they sort of indicated that there would be an agreed work programme in terms of trying to work through some of the issues with the protocol, whereas at EU level, I think they're keen to see a roadmap on its full implementation. So I think it's fair to say there's a bit of work still to be done around the protocol, and certainly, you know, the grace periods, I suppose, that have been provided are welcome, and I know certainly they would be welcomed by the authorities here in Northern Ireland. I think I've seen a figure where for the first period of the year, certainly the authorities at the ports here in Northern Ireland were doing something like 1/5 of all sort of, you know, checks that were having to be done on goods entering the single market area. So, you know, that was a huge sort of challenge for the veterinary authorities at the Northern Ireland ports, and that's with grace periods in place. So you can only imagine when grace periods end what the number of checks are going to look like. So that's a huge challenge and a huge veterinary resource, which just isn't there at the moment. So whilst they're there, you know, they are very welcome, I guess, for the period ahead.
Okay, thank you very much, Ian. Yeah, so I would like to focus now our conversation on the future prospects for EU-UK trade. But before going on to our next set of questions, I would like to launch our third and last poll for the audience, so we can also hear what are the audience views. So David, please, if you could launch the next poll. So the question of the next poll reads as follows. In your view, in the medium to long term, UK meat exports to the EU will likely go up, go down, or stay the same. And this is, of course, maybe a bit of what I call a crystal ball type of question, but it is just interesting to get a view of what are people's thoughts around future prospects. And I think, again, we'll do as we did before, like we'll give a few seconds with the poll on the screen to give you some time to reply. And meanwhile, I'll continue the conversation with our panelists. So this question is really for any of you. So up to now, we've been discussing some of the initial disruption caused by the new situation. But do you see these as teething problems, or do you foresee any other long-term implications? So really, I don't know who of you would prefer to take this one.
Yeah, Tanya, I'll just give my view that Perfect. If the things stay the same, that we do expect the exports to go down. Obviously, at the moment, there is the effect of the COVID pandemic, which is affecting demand both here and in Europe. So a lot of the actual true trading realities is masked by the effects of the pandemic. But the way that the structural costs, the structural processes that exist at the moment, both in terms of costs and in terms of time delays, we'd expect the volumes to go down unless they are addressed. And in particular, this common veterinary area is one that really needs to be looked at.
Thank you very much, Rizwan. That's very interesting to get your view from a commercial perspective. I don't know, David, if we can now close the poll and show maybe the results. Oh, we see Rizwan, again, you're very right. Most of our audience agree with you that EU, so UK meat exports to the EU will likely go down, and that's 66% of those who have replied. So that's quite clear. So thank you, David. So.
Yeah, I think on that point, Tanya, just to mention that, I mean, there's an element of preparation and how prepared our businesses. I think that what you're seeing is once now businesses are prepared with what the requirements are, they're now making economic commercial decisions as to whether this trade is still profitable. That's where the stage is at. So that's where people are choosing to stop or to reduce certain types of exports. That's once people have already tried to assess the processes and manage the processes. And what we're experiencing now on the export side, that's what our European cousins will then experience on the import side in terms of how that will affect them in October and then going forward as well. So I think it's quite important to differentiate between being prepared and then the economic decisions that then follow once everyone understands the consequences of the new relationship.
Oh, indeed, that's definitely a very valid point. So I don't know if any of our other speakers would like to add something to this, or is it clear? Maybe Knut from a European perspective.
Yes, I think when you ask about the long-term future, you should look at the market reality. The UK is a deficit market for pork. There need to be a supply of around 1 million tons into the market every year. And I'm sure that that level will continue because there are no signs that the UK self-sufficiency is going to increase. The type of problems we are talking about now, I'm sure that we'll find solutions. Now, the question is, who will be the supplier of the 1 million tons of pork a year to the UK market. That also depends on what kind of trade deals that the UK is doing with other countries in the future, with countries in North and South America. And I think in particular, when it comes to beef, there is a strong competitiveness if those countries get free access to the UK market. In pork, I don't know, we are used from our perspective to compete with Canada and the US and others in countries like Japan, Australia, South Korea, etc. So I think we would also be able to be competitive on the UK market. Other things which may change is when the UK go into agreements with countries like the US and others. Will the UK keep its equivalent EU standards? UK are free to do whatever they want, and there will be some pressure in those negotiations concerning antimicrobial treatment, growth promoters, additives, etc. So we may end up in a situation where we are moving from having the same standards and getting further away from the situation we would like to have with dynamic alignment, but that is to be seen. So the short version is, and I believe, at least in the pork side, we will continue to maintain our export level to the UK, even also when the UK make new third-country or new trade agreements with other countries in the world. The question may be answered in a different way in the beef.
Yeah, indeed. And we will come back to the topic of UK and deals with other third countries later. But maybe a question now for Rizvan again. From a business point of view, how do you think that you and business like yours will have to evolve to cope with these medium to long term implications that we've been discussing just now?
So we are in the process of looking at setting up an EU entity to basically act as the importer for our goods going in there. We do expect that to reduce the trading costs from maybe the current projection of 560,000 to maybe around 300,000. So it'll be a significant drop, but it'll still be a significant cost at the end of it. So that's one thing that we're exploring, but there's lots of other implications in terms of the local tax and company legislation that we have to explore and understand first. But that's one thing that we're looking to try to mitigate the cost impact of the new relationship. We still see that the EU being a very strong market for British sheep. They do value British sheep, and we want to try to maintain and service that market as much as we can.
Okay, thank you, Rizvan. So a last set of questions from me now. I'll start now with our European panelists, Knut and Cormac. The UK is currently, as Knut was also explaining, a key market for EU meat, but do you expect it to change in the view of the new trading relationship? And Knut touched a bit on this, so maybe you can go again first, Knut, and then Cormac if you want to add something.
No, but as I said before, I don't expect major shift in the need to import into the UK. The market is always dictating, despite what kind of bureaucracy we are running into, and we will overcome those smaller bureaucracy startup problems, and long term we will stay constant. As I said before, question mark is who is going to supply this deficit into the market. That depends on the character of future trade deals that the UK may do with North and South America, and that is in particular the case when it comes to beef.
Okay, thank you very much, Knut. Cormac, from an Irish perspective, what would you say?
I suppose I share that view. I mean, the market hasn't changed. Conditions around it, trading conditions have changed, but the market remains the same. The UK hasn't moved location either, so it's our closest neighbour, and you trade with your closest neighbour. So, I mean, for those reasons, I suppose also the UK will still have an import requirement. We certainly will have an export requirement. So for all of those reasons, I think UK will continue to be a very important market. It remains an important market within the whole European market. Let's not call it an EU market, a European meat market. The UK is still a very important player in that market, both from import and from an export perspective, as Rizvan has talked about. So I believe it will continue to be important. I think we will have to see, as Knut said, what else develops in relation to the UK's own bilateral trading agreements in the future with other potential global suppliers of meat, and what that may bring in terms of changes in the market or different competition or different competitive pressures. But for the short to medium term, it certainly is going to continue to be an important market for us.
Thank you very much, Cormac. And now a similar question to Rizvan and Ian, but this time from a UK perspective. Do you foresee the UK exporters shifting their attention to other areas of the world, given the trade friction they are facing now with Europe, and also given the new trade deals that the UK is negotiating with other third countries? So we can go maybe first with Rizvan and then with Ian for a specific Northern Ireland perspective.
Yeah, I think, I mean, Phil touched upon the Open Doors campaign that DIT is running in the UK. That's important to open up other markets around the world. Lamb as a protein is in short supply around the world, so there are opportunities elsewhere. But our product is at a premium placement compared to the other big lamb exporters such as Australia and New Zealand on the world market, and we'll be positioned such that our volumes will not be high going into any markets, because the New Zealanders and Australians are already in those markets. So the volumes that we'll be able to export to those other markets will be restricted. But that's not to say there isn't opportunities. But the first step is for the government to open up, particularly the markets like China and the US, where there is some opportunity there to increase the trade. I would say on the wider meat side, there's definitely opportunities around the world as global middle class is growing. But I think it's important to recognize that the rest of the world hasn't suddenly become easier. It's just that now going to Europe is the same as going to the rest of the world. So in a way, the processes are now the same whether you go to EU or the rest of the world. It's not that the rest of the world has become any easier. You still have the challenges of logistics. You still have the challenges of language and culture. So whilst there will be some opportunities over there, I think the realistic targeting those markets, it wouldn't surpass what we have in the EU.
Thank you, Rizvan. Ian, do you want to add something?
Yeah, certainly from a Northern Irish point of view, certainly the view of our meat exporters has always been, well, I guess since the beef export ban was lifted in 2006, certainly the view has been to try and get as much market access as possible around the world, as opposed to sell every component of the carcass that can be sold in the best paying markets available. So I think that continues to be I suppose the general ethos. Our businesses have been, I suppose, growing their exports to some third country markets in recent years, in particular, through Hong Kong and North America and the Middle East and some African nations. But I guess those markets will never replace the fresh, chilled trade in domestic and EU markets. That, I suppose, where the vast majority of our meat goes to. So that'll always be, I suppose, the core focus of our businesses. But certainly as markets, particularly in Asia, particularly the Asian markets, as they continue to grow, certainly in terms of their demand for meat, and also the opportunities in those regions open up as consumer purchasing power improves. Certainly there will be an interest in trying to access more opportunities there, and certainly hopefully China will be the next biggest prize, I guess, for UK exporters if we can get that one across the line. Certainly, I think Rizwan has mentioned some of the key opportunities in North America as well. So, I think there's a keenness to look at those markets as and when they become available, and certainly it's one not to lose sight of, if we can get that market access improved.
Thank you very much, Ian. So more on this topic, we are receiving some questions from the audience. So I'm gonna ask you now, and I guess this is maybe for Cormac, but also Ian. Well, let's see. I'm gonna read it out loud so you can have a look and you can take the floor if you feel that you can provide an answer. So the question is, what strategic change are the big Anglo-Irish meat processors that operate in Ireland and the UK likely to take, especially if faced with increased competition from the rest of the world exporters? So I don't know if who of you would prefer to take the floor.
I can maybe start on that, Tanya. I mean, I suppose firstly, from an overall perspective from the Irish sector, I mean, once the Brexit vote took place and throughout the whole process of the negotiations, which ran for 4 years, I mean, we had always been clear that we continue to believe that the UK market is central to us. It's our next door neighbour, it's our closest market, the strong linkages are there, so that everything and anything that we do should try to maintain our position and our share in that market. That's about being as competitive as possible. It's about being having the strongest relationships possible with customers and the customer base there, and having an offering that continues to engage the customer. That doesn't change. Clearly, throughout the last 4 years, there's been a renewed effort on international market access, knowing that there will be perhaps changes in the UK market where there will be greater competition. Maybe some pointed to and asked questions as to whether or not our overall reliance on the UK market was too high. I mean, it certainly was over 50% of our beef was going to the UK market, and there were questions raised around whether our reliance was, in any event, was too great on one single market. But I still see it accounting for a major proportion of our beef exports, but we have pushed to try and develop the alternative market access options available to us. But equally knowing that none of those will deliver the kind of returns that the UK market, by and large, can return. It's still a high-priced, high-value, premium market, and I mean, there is also the fact that it's different type of cuts and different parts of the carcass that you're going to be shipping perhaps to some of the new developing markets in Asia and wherever else. So I think we continue to work to make sure that the offering that is available and presented to UK customers is as strong as possible. And at the same time, as every other industry that's on the call here from whatever origin, we all want to have as many markets open to us as possible to ensure the best possible carcass balance.
Yeah, indeed. This is definitely a very valid point. Thank you very much, Cormac. So we have another question from the audience, in particular regarding comments that have been made regarding the common veterinary area, and they are asking, is agreeing a common veterinary area achievable in the current political climate? So I think it was Ian who mentioned this earlier, and Rizwan, any of you would like to have a go at this question?
Yeah, I mean, I don't see why you wouldn't be, Tanya. I know there has been some exploration from the British perspective on some other standards where it could deviate from the EU norms. But on the whole, the veterinary and the food standards will be very heavily aligned, if not in wording, but very much in principles. So I think that the opportunity is there. I don't think there's a lot of opportunity for divergence. So I think it's just the government policymakers to have a look at this to sort of see that can we do this, because it would make a major difference to both the import, for which we are a heavily importing country as a UK, as well as the export. So I think that for the wins that we'll get from having a common veterinary area, it's definitely worth the policymakers looking at this. I don't know what Ian thinks about it.
Yeah, no, other than, I guess, I know that the British Meat Processors Association published a very insightful report last week, certainly looking at I suppose, the impact of Brexit, 3 months on, and certainly as part of one of their solutions to I suppose, the systemic rather than teething problems that were identified in that report was really around a number of options, looking at the potential of that, veterinary agreement. There are a number of options for that. So I think you'll see a bit of conversation on that, in the months and weeks ahead. But the whole political environment, I guess, around sort of Brexit has become a bit tense, certainly around, COVID-19 vaccinations, as you mentioned earlier, and the potential triggering of the Article 16 agreement here in Northern Ireland, which caused all sorts of people to raise all sorts of issues around the whole process. So, I guess things, are a bit tense in terms of the negotiations between the EU and the UK around certain issues. But I suppose when you look at the cold, hard facts on the ground and what's happening on the ground, there possibly will be room for negotiation of some of these issues. I think there'll have to be, once the full application of controls are applied at both within the UK and the EU, just the challenges of making that work in practice. I think you'll find the scope for negotiating some of these things will improve.
Okay, Ian, thank you very much for that, and thank you very much all of our speakers. I think I'm conscious of time. Oh, sorry, Cormac, did you want to add something?
I was just going to say, I mean, I think too that the way you asked the question kind of framed it in a particular way that, is it achievable in the current political environment? We have to keep pushing. I think that we're talking about business and the business and trading environment, and work on things like the various anomalies that have been there that we've talked about earlier in terms of chilled product, work on whether there's practical solutions around groupage of sealed pallets, etc. I'm not sure does that work or does it really solve it, but we have to be able to explore those and even look like things, just practical things of whether or not we can use traces, I mean, between us, I mean, that will ease operations for both UK exporters and EU exporters into the UK. So, I mean, I think we have to keep it focused and we have to keep pushing the agenda of the business and trading environment.
Indeed. So again, thank you very much. Thanks, Cormac, and all of our speakers for their insights and their time today. I think it has been a very interesting discussion. I'll now pass over to Phil for the concluding remarks, because I'm aware we are running out of time. Thank you.
Thanks, Tanya, and thanks again. I think good point there, really, Cormac, to kind of bring that session to a close, is the importance of ongoing trade in whatever guise, and to continue to push for the most appropriate, most workable, most practical kind of agreement and ongoing business both in and out of UK and Europe and further afield. So just want to pick up on a few of the key points that were raised during that discussion. And Ian and Cormac raised the market access opportunities. Of course, growing access is also a critical thing to increase those opportunities and carcass balance and add to opportunities and mitigate risk. And of course, we live in volatile times. Rizvan's comments around exporters being equipped for the future, that may mean that exporters are more able or more encouraged to look to further third country type markets and broaden their export reach. But I mean, it will remain a fact that the EU is our nearest market, most valuable, we're most well established, etc. And particularly for businesses like Rizvan's, they built up significant commercial trade and reputation in that area, and you know, that's hard won and easily lost. So, you know, we must continue to try and exploit those opportunities. And from our own experience and our teams based in France and across Europe, you know, they're committed to continuing to support exports to the region. And then Nud's point, the UK will remain a net importer, so clearly ongoing trade and frictionless, or trade with as little friction as possible, is going to be critical going forward. So I think some really good discussion there and some key points, but we're all pretty much landing on the same place, which is that ongoing trade is important, and we need to make sure that it's as viable and as realistic as possible for all businesses, whether they be smaller businesses shipping in pallets or larger businesses shipping in loads, because the costs associated with that are disproportionately impacted those smaller businesses. So with that, I'd like to take the opportunity to formally thank all the speakers for their insight and input, representing their own sectors or their own geographical regions. That's been excellent discussion and debate. And thank you as delegates for joining. I would like to ask you to, when the webinar ends, there will be a short survey in terms of how useful you found this webinar, and I would appreciate you taking just a second to fill that in, because it informs what we might do going forward. The video will be available within the next 24 hours and will be sent to you, and again you'll be able to share that with your colleagues, and slides will be made available online. So on behalf of AHDB and the export team, I would like to thank all our speakers and you as attendees. I hope you found it useful, and I wish you a very good afternoon. Thank you.